What is the building type? Think about it this way. At the very extreme of this continuum of building types, there are two very obvious ones. There's the smallest one that's a house, all kinds of sizes, different configurations, right? And at the other end of that continuum is the very tallest building you can think of, tower or high-rise. And so everything in between is what we're going to be talking about. But these two at either end of this continuum are what we call the palette of building types. And this is a diagram we prepared to simply communicate that there are lots of names and variations for the same thing. Let's say a sixplex, what you would call a sixplex. Our colleagues in St. Louis might call a mansion apartment. And I would call that same thing a mansion apartment out here in California. In Florida, that same thing might be called a six-pack or a sixplex or other things. So you might know these building types that I'm going to talk about today with a different name, but that's assumed. Regional variations, even local variations, that's part of the really cool thing about these kinds of things. It's to be customized. It's to be tailored to your situation. But at the root of it, there are certain basic types that repeat, and that's what I'm talking about. Because I could see if you said, well, there's this type, there's that type, there's 100 million types. When you think about it, there's really about like 15 or 16. And all these variations fit under one of those types. So let's go through this. Remember I talked about house scale. I might have said house form. The slides here say form, so I'm going to continue with that. Same thing, house scale, house form. The continuum is broken into two parts. Now you can understand that at one end there's the smallest house, and at the other end there are towers, right? So the towers are block form, and the houses are house form, and then in between that's where we're going to talk about how that works. On the house form end of it, there's different kinds of houses. There's duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. There's what we call a multiplex small, a cottage court, a courtyard apartment, and a multiplex large. And usually these buildings top out in the house form end of it, 3 stories, maybe sometimes 4 in some cases, and 20, 25 units. You're talking about buildings like that. You're not talking about buildings bigger. Buildings bigger are in the block form end of the continuum or this palette. And they tend to include the townhouses of varying sizes. Sometimes there are 2-story or 3-story single-family townhouses. Sometimes there are 5-story townhouses that are flats, have 5 units in them, 3 or 4 units. There's the Main Street building of different sizes, small and large. There's these buildings that have garages inside of them, or older buildings that have theaters inside of them and actually have a ring building along the sidewalk, or we call a lined building. And then you have mid-rise, 7, 8, 10-story buildings, and then you have high-rise or tower. And for this diagram, I've just put the tower to combine mid-rise and high-rise. So that's the palette of building types that we're talking about. As I mentioned earlier, you might know some of these as a different type and with a different name and a little variation of what I'm going to show you, but it's likely that it's going to fit into one of these categories. And if it doesn't, if you say, wow, I have one of these and I think that it's really missing from this palette, please let me know. And I'd love to talk to you about it and see if we should add it. Now, before we go further, I just want to give you another way to think about this. Because like I said at the beginning of this course, there's a lot of disagreement about this technique. There's a lot of skepticism about building types and that they have a role at all. So one day I was thinking, how could I explain this in another way that's not related to zoning, not related to architecture at all, urbanism, anything. And I thought of teeth, your mouth. So look at this. This is a map of your mouth, top and bottom. I'm just going to focus on the bottom part of the mouth right now. And you see that there are different sized teeth because they're in different positions, different locations in your mouth. They have a different role. Some are larger in the back because they have a certain role of how they operate. And some are smaller and sharper in the front because of how they operate and where they are located in your mouth. And I thought, man, there's such an analogy here with buildings in the built environment. Some buildings are bigger and closer to bigger streets. Some buildings are smaller and tucked away in certain locations or around a side street away from busy streets. And there's this logic that you could put together and you can observe and build communities about where buildings of certain sizes and certain configurations actually work the best and serve their occupants the best. And so this is how cities have been built for a long time. That's why great neighborhoods have that appeal, because people can see this. They might not know to look for it, but it's observable once you can walk around and see it. So I thought using the teeth in the mouth is a great way to illustrate this. So let's take the 4 teeth in the front, which are your incisors. They're very sharp and they're small. And let's use the analogy that we're going to use density or floor area ratio, and we're just going to combine the equivalent of those 4. We're going to combine them in this area, and then we're going to combine them into 1. So they're not 4 anymore, but we haven't exceeded the amount. Like if there was a rule here about there's a maximum amount of tooth that you can have, we haven't exceeded that amount of tooth or teeth here. And now, because there aren't any rules about where these things can go, we're just going to put it back where those 4 were. And how silly would that be? It's completely silly. Of course, where these teeth need to go, the equivalent of zoning now for our mouth, and the zoning doesn't say anything about that. It just says the numbers. It just says don't exceed this amount of tooth area. But it doesn't say anything about, well, the incisor really needs to be in these locations and it works best here and the molars work best here. It doesn't say that. Our rules equivalent to zoning don't say that, because we're using the analogy of building types, right? I'm simply making the analogy of the role of teeth in your mouth is similar to the role of buildings in the city, in the town, in the village. There is a logic to why they go in certain places and why they work in certain places better, and how you assemble them together. So let's talk about building types in detail. The things you look for in a building type are not use, okay? Use doesn't, you don't see use here on this list of characteristics. The things you look for is, first, is it attached or detached? Is it house form or block form? What are the lot widths and lot depths that are needed to really accommodate what this type does? So the needs for a house are going to be very, very different than the needs for, say, a mansion apartment building that has 6 or 8 units in it, right? What is its building footprint? Like, what does it need to be effective, and where is it that it should stop? How big should it get and not be any bigger to be a good neighbor to the buildings around it? What is its massing? Does it matter, or does it have certain massing requirements for that type? For example, there are some buildings that you want them to have intensity, like say a cottage court is very low intensity in its appearance, but it often has the most intense building of the several buildings on its lot. Let's say a 2-story building sometimes, way in the back, and along the sides of the garden, there are little 1-story cottages. In California, you see a lot of that, but they're little houses arranged around a court, and so that would be a massing instruction for that type. Same with a courtyard apartment. It might have that kind of a massing instruction, where other buildings, they're already small enough, they don't need any more massing controls. What about the number of units? This is very controversial with public sector planners and some code practitioners. They say, how can you determine how many units are in there? That's left up to the process. It is if you're dealing with density and you have to figure out, okay, now the calculation says I'm allowed to do X number of units. How do I fit them on this site? Yeah, that's very difficult to understand how you're going to do that just mathematically. But if you're using a building type and you've done the research to understand the lot widths and lot depths and the building footprints and all those things that make a house different from a duplex, different from a fourplex, different from a mansion apartment, different from a courtyard, different from a multiplex large. Once you understand all those things, you can start to predetermine with accuracy in a community, wow, these lot depths of, say, 75 by 150 will accommodate this type, that type, and this type. And we know already that they won't work for these other 2 types, because we know that these other 2 types need more lot width or need more lot depth. And all of a sudden, you can be very intentional and articulate about what each type needs. So And the last category here is common open space. Does the type that you're looking at, does it integrate common open space in, like say, cottage court or a courtyard? Or does it rely on little private patios or something like that, or a balcony, and it uses civic spaces down the street? So let's look at the profile of a building type. This is one of the code pages, the typical code pages we provide for a building type. And this first page is all about the intent. You see the name of the type, the photos, and then a description. And the description is talking about the role of this type in the neighborhood or the area that this is allowed in, the kinds of situations or contexts it works well in, or where it's allowed, the zones that it's allowed in, and then what's its form and scale. So this is all the intent. What is this purpose to do? On the right-hand side of the spread are what we call the site standards. So we talk about the number of units or dwellings here, as it says, the size and massing of this particular building type. You can divide it up however you want. You can move it around, but here are some realities about how big this building needs to be and how big it can be in order to still stay a good neighbor. And then frontages. How does this building relate to the public realm? How does it shape the public realm? Pedestrian access. Does this type depend on pedestrian access all from the front, or can some be from the side and some be from the front? Or does it go through a garden? In this case, it's multiplex small, and the units can be from the front and the side. Common open space, what requirements are there? So these are basic characteristics. You can apply more, but this is what you need to know to make a building type distinct from others. And here's something to know. If you're doing this, and you find, and I've read a lot of codes where the only difference between one building type and another was a use and maybe one story. That's not a different building type. A building type, again, is a configuration. It's a repeating pattern, and whether it's 2 stories or 3 stories, that doesn't make it a different kind. That's just a taller version of the same kind. And then, lastly, you want to allow as many different types, building types, in a zoning district as it makes sense for that physical environment. So if you reverse engineer the physical environment that you're trying to make or trying to protect and make more of, if it's an existing place, you want to look at the range of building types that make sense in that area and then list them here like we have them. We have 7 types here in this zone. And usually you want at least 3. And maybe 4 or 5. In this case, there are 7, and they're all house form or house scale building types. When you do that, again, you can start to look around at the blocks and understand how they could be arranged or what shouldn't be near what. And it's a much more articulate way to prevent the things that people are trying to prevent, through the density approach. It's easier to say, wow, you know what? Let's not let the multiplex large or the stack flat type be near the house or the duplex or the triplex. They're just too big. The footprints are too large. The disparity in footprint and everything else is too wide. So let's not let those be neighbors. We could let the courtyard building be a neighbor to the multiplex large or the stack flat building. And so you can be more refined in your approach that way, rather than leaving it to numbers and saying, well, when a building gets over X units to the acre, that's just all over the place.